The Scharnhorst class of ships were built for the Kriegsmarine in the interwar period, and at the outbreak of the Second World War, they were the cornerstone of the German surface fleet. However, something that's come about since then, and especially now, is what to designate these ships. Some say battleships like the Germans, the ones who created the vessels, and some say battlecruisers like the British and some more modern historians, or some say fast battleships. In today's video, we're going to tackle that question. What should we designate these ships? But first, we need some background information to be able to deal with that question properly. Our story will begin with an event that we've discussed on the channel. On June 21st, 1919, when the German High Seas Fleet scuttled itself en masse. In part leading to the future Reichsmarine, the navy under the Weimar Republic with only remnants of the formidable High Seas Fleet. Now, with that being said, the Treaty of Versailles limited the German Navy to 6 pre-dreadnoughts with an additional 2 in reserve, 6 light cruisers with an additional 2 in reserve, and torpedo boats. This force was augmented by the building of new ships, with a displacement of up to 10,000 tons, but only to replace existing ships, the pre-dreadnoughts of the Deutschland/Lothringen classes. Germany's naval leaders in the Reichsmarine had a desire to improve their situation at the earliest opportunity. In the early 1920s, there were hopes to replace the pre-dreadnoughts and older cruisers with new construction, but with the Weimar Republic's political and financial instability, that was easier said than done. To quote from Battleships of the Scharnhorst class, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the backbone of the German surface force at the outbreak of war by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, they write, "Between the end of 1918 and the 30th of January 1933, there were 20 cabinets with 12 different Reich chancellors, allowed for little continuity of purpose, along with economic troubles leading to crippling inflation, and new warships weren't exactly a high priority. Until the late 1920s, when things begin to stabilize. The first new replacement for the pre-dreadnoughts would be the Deutschland class of Panzerschiff." Preliminary designs for new capital ships for the Reichsmarine was dated to 1928. With the secret approval of the government, they planned for ships with a standard displacement of 17,500 tons. Their armament consisting of 305mm guns, 150mm guns, and 88mm guns. By 1930, the government agreed to the so-called Ship Replacement Building Plan, which, to quote again from Battleships of the Scharnhorst class, in 1930, the Reich government agreed to the introduction of the so-called Ship Replacement Building Plan, due to complete in 1938, and from this, there emerged in 1933 the Rebuilding Plan, which embodied the policy of having in commission 6 pre-dreadnoughts or armored cruisers, 1 aircraft carrier, 6 cruisers, 6 destroyers or torpedo boat half-flotillas, 3 minesweeping half-flotillas, 3 E-boat half-flotillas, 3 U-boat half-flotillas, 1 sail training ship, and 1 mine-laying group. In addition, the creation of a naval air arm was predicted consisting of 9 small squadrons and more besides. This plan came into effect in November 1932 under the control of the Reich Defense Minister Kurt von Schleicher. Furthermore, the commissioning of the Deutschland class certainly had the nations of France and the United Kingdom interested, as have we discussed in previous videos. So much so that France, in part with also the Reichsmarine in mind, ordered 2 ships of the Dunkirk class, with these 2 powerful vessels armed with 8 330mm guns and a design top speed of up to 29.5 knots. They hoped to counter the threat posed by the Deutschland class in the Atlantic, along with helping out the older battleships in the Marine Nationale against the battle line of the Italian Reichsmarine. Anyway, to get back to the subject at hand, the building of these French ships caught the eye of the Germans, who reviewed their naval planning. With the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany and Adolf Hitler taking the reins of government in 1933, he embarked on an ambitious rearmament program, of which it's probable that these plans came about in April of 1934 with Deutschland's Norwegian crews when Hitler was aboard along with the chief of the naval staff, Admiral Erich Schrader, and other parts of the German military, of which the building contracts for 2 armored ships, D and E, had been placed. These were going to be vessels that would respond to the Dunkirk and Strasbourg. These ships displacing some 20,000 tons with an improved armor protection scheme of an armored belt of around 220mm, a citadel of 50mm, an armored deck of 80mm, and a conning tower of 300mm. The main armament consisting of 283mm guns, some thought was given to putting the guns in quadruple turrets like their French counterparts. However, this would have required a completely new design. They would also carry 150mm, 105mm, 37mm, and 20mm guns, along with torpedo tubes. Further consideration was given to matching or exceeding the main armament of the French battleships, with 330, 350, or 381mm guns being considered, but this too would require a rework to the design. Another issue for these plans would have been the fact that Hitler would not have approved them, since he was making overtures to the United Kingdom, hoping to reconcile with the world's leading naval power at the time. Any armament planned over the 283mm design could have jeopardized the negotiations for the eventual Anglo-German naval agreement, but the keels for these two vessels would be scrapped on the stocks in the summer of 1934, with the German naval architects beginning work on new plans based on the principles of the former design. The following year would see the keels laid down for ships D and E, which would be named Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The size of these two vessels was now officially 26,000 tons, but in reality, that would not be the case. The main battery was increased as well, from 6 283mm guns to 9 and 3 triple turrets, along with that thicker armor that offered resistance to 330mm shells. An emphasis was put on protection against bombs and torpedoes. Along with that, there were difficulties in choosing the main plant, with some wanting to use diesel plants and others wanting to use steam turbines, both having their pros and cons, of which, to quote from Battleships of the Scharnhorst-class, all types of marine engines have their pros and cons. The diesel motor is instantly ready to provide drive. That is, it can be put at maximum output from zero. All that is required is the push of a button. With steam drive, much more time is required. A steam plant has to work up to maximum output because time is needed before the boilers can supply the steam requirement. From cold, that is when all the boilers are shut down and no turbines are preheated. The process takes about 2 hours. Going on to describe how diesel is more economical with fuel, while the steam plant is more advantageous in taking up floor space. Now, by no means am I qualified to discuss an exhaustive list of the various advantages and disadvantages of the different drives. Still, the important thing is that steam drive was chosen over diesel. Another thing that was clear was the construction of the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Was a clear breach of the Versailles Treaty, only to be sanctioned retroactively by the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Or to take from Koop and Schmolke again, from a political perspective, the building of battleships D and E was a clear breach of the Versailles Treaty, as was the declaration of military sovereignty on March 16, 1935. The tonnage of the armored cruisers B and C, Admiral Scheer and Admiral Graf Spee, also amounted to an infringement of the treaty. The decision to build the latter pair was approved by the pre-Hitler Reich government and Reichstag, and the culpability for the decision lies with these institutions. The building of the much larger Scharnhorst-class was sanctioned retroactively by the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935. Moving on to the design of the Gneisenau, as she is my favorite of the two, the ship was built by the Deutsche Werke in Kiel, having a standard displacement as of 1935 of 31,632 tons, and an operational tonnage of 37,902 tons. As for machinery, Gneisenau had 12 boilers that powered 3 sets of geared turbines, an individual housing, and 3 turbine rooms, which drove 3 shafts, producing a maximum of 160,050 shaft horsepower, giving the ship a top speed of 30.7 knots. As for armaments, the main battery consisted of 9 Model 1934 283mm 54 caliber guns and triple turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. As for the secondary battery, it would consist of 12 150mm guns, with 8 in twin mountings and the other 4 in single mountings. There were also 14 105mm guns in twin turrets originally, with 16 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 10 20mm guns in single mountings. With this being said, there were later refits that would modify the armament. One of them was in 1941 when Gneisenau received 2 triple sets of torpedoes from the light cruiser Leipzig. Anyway, at the thickest point, the armor belt would be 350mm, with the bulkheads varying between 150mm to 200mm. The upper deck would have 50mm of armor, and the armored deck would vary between 80 and 95mm, while the armored deck slopes varied from 105mm to 110mm in thickness. The main battery turret face was 360mm, the sides 180, the rear 350, and the roof 180. She was laid down in May of 1935, launched in December of 1936, and commissioned in May of 1938. With all of that being said, both ships certainly had interesting careers, with Gneisenau being bombed following the Channel Dash while she was being repaired in Kiel in early 1942. And due to the disastrous Battle of the Barents Sea, Hitler ordered all repair work ceased in early 1943, while the Scharnhorst was sunk in the Battle of the North Cape in late 1943. At this point, we've covered the careers extensively, and I'll post links down in the description so you can get a better idea of what they did in their careers. Nevertheless, what were these ships? Battleships, fast battleships, or battlecruisers? Taking from Koop and Schmolke once more, the 2 battleships were children of their time, and their construction was completed against the backdrop of portentous political change in Germany and Europe. Even the experts disagree upon an exact definition of what type the ships were. Some spoke of battlecruisers, others of battleships. Both were correct within limits. The description fast battleship probably comes closest, which I think an interesting quote to kick us off for this discussion, where we'll take a crack at the reasoning for calling the ships battlecruisers first. Where on the 20th of September 1939, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill telegraphed to General Smuts in South Africa, "Monitor Erebus is ready to sail for Cape Town. As you know, we have never considered 15-inch guns necessary for the defense of Cape Town, but to please Perrault, agreed to loan Erebus until those defenses were modernized given his fear of attack by Japan. We realize the defenses of Cape Town remain weak. Still, the Germans have no battleships and only the 2 battlecruisers they possess, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, would be very unlikely to try to reach South African waters, or if they did, risk damage far from a friendly dockyard from even weak defenses. Or, for example, when Scharnhorst was sunk in 1943, Churchill wrote to Stalin, "The Arctic convoys to Russia have brought us luck. Yesterday, an enemy attempted to intercept with the battlecruiser Scharnhorst. Commander-in-Chief Admiral Fraser, with Duke of York, 35,000-ton battleship, cut off Scharnhorst's retreat and after an action sunk her." The point of that was to illustrate the fact that there is historical precedence to calling the ships battlecruisers, and it isn't purely a modern invention, with many Allied intelligence services, naval officers, and historians referring to them as battlecruisers. However, I should say in more modern publications, they do tend to be called battlecruisers, with historians like Craig L. Simmons describing the ships as oversized battlecruisers. One of the main factors as to why people tend to call them battlecruisers is the size of the main battery. Taking from Koop and Schmolke once more, with a heavy armament of 28cm caliber, the units were too lightly armed to be rated as pure battleships, and accordingly, they are often styled battlecruisers. This isn't the end of the quote, as we'll get back to that in a later part of the video. Still, the point of the argument people make is the size of the guns doesn't necessarily match up to contemporary battleships, especially compared to the Royal Navy or the United States Navy. Yet, an interesting thing to point out is the comparison in the First World War to the High Seas Fleet battleships armed with 11-inch guns, and the Royal Navy's 12-inch gun vessels. There weren't issues calling them battleships then. What's the difference now? Another argument people make is comparing their speed and armor to other ships of the period, certainly being faster than the battleships, at least at the time of their construction, to Royal Navy or United States battleships, with speeds comparable to Hood, Renown, and Repulse, ships designated as battlecruisers by the Royal Navy. The armor of the Scharnhorst-class was certainly better than those Royal Navy battlecruisers, and better than their World War I equivalents in either the Royal Navy or High Seas Fleet, if you call them battlecruisers. However, battleships being completed at the time, such as the King George V class of the United Kingdom, the armor of the Royal Navy battleships was very comparable. Like in my video on the Deutschland class discussing similar topic, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, just a few of the main arguments people tend to make. If you have more you'd like to add, please do so down in the comments. What about the battleships? What are some of their reasonings? People also tend to call them battleships, with historians like Vincent P. O'Hara falling into this camp. But what are their reasons? The first major reason is the fact that the Germans themselves designated them as Schlachtschiff, or battleship in English. A common thing people tend to do is to refer to the ship's designation as to how the nation themselves refer to the ships. Taking from Koop and Schmolke once more, the two battleships were children of their time, and their construction was completed against the backdrop of portentous political changes in Germany and Europe, which had so influenced it. Even the experts disagreed upon an exact definition of what type the ships were. Some spoke of battlecruisers, others battleships. Both were correct within limits. The description fast battleship probably comes closest. Another reason why they tend to call them battleships is that their armor, as we mentioned, is superior to contemporary battlecruisers, and especially the battlecruisers of World War I, and therefore they find it not accurate to compare them with such vessels. However, one thing that is hard to fight is the size of their guns, as contemporary battleships certainly had larger guns, where typically they'd point to this part in the quote I didn't finish earlier. The choice of caliber was a political decision and not a military one. It was essentially a form of interim solution intended to be remedied later with a much larger caliber. So the class was to mount larger guns, more specifically 381mm guns or 15-inch ones, something that would have happened in future refits, in which Gneisenau almost received them. As mentioned before, following the devastating bombing in Kiel, Gneisenau was taken to the city of Gottenhofen, or what was Gdynia, where she was going to be repaired and upgunned. Taking from Daniel Knowles in his book Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the extensive damage that was sustained by the Gneisenau from the explosion of the forward turret convinced Naval High Command to rebuild Gneisenau to mount 6 15-inch guns as had been originally planned, as opposed to simply repairing the ship. The damaged bow section was removed so that a lengthened bow could be constructed, which would serve to correct the decrease in freeboard that would have been caused by the heavier 15-inch guns. On July 1st, the ship was formally decommissioned, with it being paid off, and the crew redeployed in the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine. This didn't happen as previously mentioned, but it does show the ships were capable of mounting larger guns. An interesting point. Like I said before, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, just a few of the main arguments people tend to make. If you had more you'd like to add, please do so down in the comments. The last and final argument, the fast battleship argument, is interesting as it's similar to the battleship argument, adding to it with the speed of the vessels being faster than the more traditional battleships in service at the time, with speeds comparable to later battleships such as the Iowa-class, with a few knots difference. It's something that we've touched on in other videos by quoting Koop and Schmolke, who certainly believe this to be the most apt designation. I'll grant you that, like any other argument, there's nuance to this, and I'm just giving a brief overlook into the arguments. However, there's good reason, as I don't necessarily fall into any camp when it comes to the ships, because I genuinely don't believe that it matters what the ship's designated as it doesn't affect the service career of the ships, and designations have devolved into tools for people on the internet to feel better and more important than someone else, and to talk down to them. Regardless of what I believe, people will continue to argue about these sorts of things as long as they have opinions, so forever. Feel free to do so down in the comments here. All I ask is you be respectful to one another. Although I don't necessarily care, I do think saying I don't care is a bit of a cop-out. Now if I were to throw my hat in the ring, I'd be in the third camp, the fast battleship camp, as I think it makes the most sense. But before we go, let's look at a poll I did for this, and it appears most people think they're battlecruisers, something I didn't think was going to happen, as they are certainly a unique class of ships. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. And until next time, my friends, have a great day. Don't forget to be respectful to one another down in the comments.